Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ashley and Clayton, for that presentation. Next, we are going to move on and talk about positive pedagogy in field hockey. So that's something that is very close and dear to my heart, being a field hockey player. So Phil Edwards, who is from USA Field Hockey, is going to present on organizational positive pedagogy in field hockey. This is a slight different thing to what he talked about in the book that he in 2020. But I think it'll be a great way to show how those people who we had a question about coaching education and how you could get over some of the issues there. I think this will be a good presentation that will answer some of those questions. So Phil is the Senior Manager of Coaching and Performance at USA Field Hockey. This is a role that includes oversight of the Olympic development pathway and junior high performance program. And he also provides coach development support. So he supports the coaches when they're coaching too. Phil is like myself, and Ashley is originally from the UK, and he spent the past decade in the US, where he came over initially to coach at the NCAA level, and then the senior international level, and then before with USA Field Hockey, and has now stepped into the role he currently has. He's also pursuing a professional doctorate in elite performance sport at Dublin City University, focusing on talent identification and development. So me and Phil sometimes have a fireside chat to talk about these different things. One little anecdote before he gets going. Phil and I coached against each other a couple of times, and I think Phil is 2-0. So there you go. So here we go, Phil. You're ready to roll.
I'm good. Okay, great. These are the secrets of how to beat Stephen at field hockey games. But thanks for the intro, Stephen. Great to be here. Good afternoon, good morning, or wherever we are in the world. Yeah, as Stephen mentioned, I had the opportunity to write a book chapter on coaching elite level field hockey, and I think it was actually the 2017 edition, the second, well, maybe a bit later, the second edition of the Positive Pedagogy book. At that time, my role was very much on the field. I was an assistant coach of the women's national team, and then leading the under-21 program. And the ideas I shared in that book chapter were related to delivering and supporting those under-21 athletes as they made the journey towards the senior team. Since that time, my role's changed, like Stephen said. Now I oversee the Olympic development pathway, but also work with our coach development and so on. So when I was approached to share some ideas on positive pedagogy in field hockey, it seemed sensible to look at it from my current role, which is more working in NGB, so on an organizational level. How do we go about shaping conversation, changing or guiding coaching behavior, and ultimately informing the player experience on a national level across the US. So my intent today is I'm going to share 4 different types of resources and tools that we've used that I would say were broadly aligned with the ideas of positive pedagogy. And indeed, I mean, we had to listen to Stephen's introduction on the topic, and all the areas he highlighted really align with what we try and do as an organization in terms of serving members, growing the game, and succeeding internationally. I'm conscious that depending on where we are in the world, we may or may not have as much awareness of what field hockey is. So I think this might be the first video today. So Stephen, please give me some feedback if this doesn't play smoothly, and we can skip over the future ones in the presentation. But just a little taster for those who are not familiar with field hockey.
Being different isn't tough. Being different makes you tough. And we're all different. So together on the field, we're unstoppable, unbreakable, bonded for life. We are a family, not teammates, sharing our pain to make it half as painful, sharing our victories to be twice the joy. From our home fields to the world stage, we are one, together. USA Field Hockey. This is where we play.
Okay, so field hockey, 11v11 invasion game. Probably the easiest way to think of it is soccer with sticks and without offside, and you can only score when you're in the area as such. So these 4 kind of different strategies, resources, tools that I'm going to share today. The most impactful positive pedagogy aligned resource, in my opinion, would be, I think it's called the hook. Hang around for the end and I'll let you know what I think is the most impactful one we use. But philosophically, across all our programs, starting with across our Olympic development program, we use this, we developed what we term the USA way, as many Olympic development pathways or player development environments would do. So our united approach to changing the game really focused on 3 things. 1, the mission is to change the game at international level, is to do things differently, to have players who break the mold as such, to not feel like we're looking over someone else's fence to steal ideas, but they are looking over our fence and saying, we want to take that from what the US are doing. So fundamentally, this is about trying to support the development of athletes who can change the game in the future. Secondly, it's about supporting personal best performance for wherever these athletes are in their development journey, wherever they enter the system. Whatever their potential is, it's about helping them achieve their potential and ultimately do it in a way where they drive their own car on the development journey. And then finally, it's our compass. It gives us a clear direction of travel, alignment around language and so on, that helps us make sure that wherever we are in the country, wherever these athletes or players, should I say, are having their USA field hockey experience, there's real connection about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. And perhaps most relevant in terms of the positive pedagogy approach is that we try and communicate this to coaches by taking the original kind of 4-corner model of thinking about player development and reconceptualize it into this idea that everything happens within the psychosocial lens of the individual athlete. So whether we're talking whatever scale we're talking about that from, whether we're talking about the micro moments within practice or the bigger kind of socio-cultural aspects, but we really approach how we support the development of athletes through a psychosocial lens as a real starting point for us. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is develop, and this is perhaps a little bit cliche, but it sticks as such, is we're trying to support the development of adaptable, not adapted athletes who can thrive in the future version of the game. On a psychosocial level, some of that stuff right now, we're starting to explore some of the psychological characteristics of developing excellence a little bit more, looking at how we can build some interventions on different levels to support the development of some of those traits that we would see would support the development of athletes, or the ongoing development of athletes along their journey. Okay, so the first resource to share, and all these resources are either publicly available or accessible via links at the end of the presentation, and I'll share them afterwards as well. But the first one to share is really, I guess you could call this a soft touch coaching approach. So this is a response to the pandemic and lockdown last year. We built our own backyard version of the game, and this builds on the work of Shane Pill, who's joining us later, Dave Cohen, Mitch Hewitt, and so on down in Australia with their work in backyard league and I think home court or driveway tennis. I think in this instance, originally this was a resource designed to support players who are used to being participating in our sport within a very hopefully athlete-centered but coach-led environment, whether that be within clubs, high school, or the Olympic development pathway. Support them at a time when they didn't have access to that, to build their own games to help their ongoing development and hopefully have some fun whilst they're doing it. And I'll share in the resources at the end. The resource list is a really good article on driveway tennis by Shane that hits on a lot of the real benefits of this kind of approach, whether it be the collaborative nature of building games together, whether it's I guess drawing out a tactical understanding through how players design games and modify games as we go through. Indeed, this resource, whilst soft touch from a coaching perspective, we had conversations with a number of parent groups around how they might use this, especially with younger players, their children, around co-creating games in the backyards to support their development. So the game design, or the game builder, was the first phase of this that you can see on the screen right now. Then there was a whole bunch of kind of add-on resources that started to build up over time. So the first ones we released were these hero power cards. So these were modifications for individual players if they had the hero power to allow them to, I guess, spotlight specific skills or attributes within the game and have the ability to essentially practice those skills within the game itself and be rewarded for using them. And these were based around our national team players. We actually produced a set of legacy cards as well, based on legends of the game on the men's and the women's side as well, which is a really nice way of connecting our current player group coming through the junior teams and so on and younger with both current national team players, but those who paved the way before them. There's also a set of ones I made myself that are cricket hero power cards that, again, I'll share that resource in the links if anyone is interested in that piece. The second addition we added in was goalkeeping cards. So these didn't modify the attributes of players, they modified the game itself. So how you would score goals or how hard it might be to score goals was related to whichever goalkeeper you chose to play in goal for you, or potentially that your opponent could assign to you, or maybe you randomly chose one to vary the game in front of you. The third bit, we produced a series of win the moment cards linked to real world scenarios from our men's and women's national teams. And when I shared this out, Shane again shared some stuff back on Twitter around, I think it was Launder's idea of fantasy games. So these vignettes or real world moments in time that are kind of captured and then presented as a challenge or a problem to be solved by the player group. And there's a wonderful, if you follow the Aussie rules stuff, the AFL put out a great fantasy games tweet or promotional video this week. It's fantastic. Again, I'll share that afterwards. But what we're hopefully trying to do is this idea that your backyard is your stage. Here's a bunch of resources that can help you as an individual athlete or group of athletes design your own games. So in soft touch, kind of from a distance approach to coaching, or in the role of parents, could be co-creating these games with your children in the backyard. There were a couple of other resources as well that are more than technical or skill specific, so the skill challenge spinner, or some of these dice that would challenge athletes or players, should I say, in different ways. What's next with this, I think it's been on my docket to do for a while, but is a coaches and teachers and parents resource of what this might look like within the context of either a curriculum in the case of teachers, or just using it at home or in informal sessions if you're a parent. So that's our first resource. So it's a soft touch approach to coaching from distance. But as we come back together, certainly all or some aspects of this will inform the athlete or player experience on the ground post-COVID as well. Especially we'd use a lot of the win the moment cards, the scenario cards in our junior high performance environment. The second one was another COVID response resource again. So at this moment in time, kind of soft touch approach or hands-off approach to supporting athlete development from distance. If the backyard field hockey was really around player designed games, this remote training resource is really around player designed programming. So rather than when COVID hit, and this is, as you will, a theme to all of this is all of these ideas lean heavily on something someone else has done already. So Mark Cairns from Coach Logic shared some of his use of this with his rugby sides in Scotland, and it seemed to us as a good solution for engaging athletes who had a whole myriad of different realities in their world as lockdown hit. So what it did do is get them to think about how they might design their training week. They were supported from distance by coaches through the form of resources that might guide them towards specific areas of development or specific ways of training. The point systems were deliberately manipulated from distance to guide athletes towards, I guess, optimal or more optimal ways of building their weekly plan. And then we had a whole junior high performance university kind of curriculum that connected the players with experts in these across these 4 pillars of play, train, recover, and prepare, to help them become, as again the theme is, to drive their own car on their development journey. As we head back, thanks Stephen, 5 minutes, got you. As we head back into more contact post-COVID, I think what I would like to see, or where I think I can see this going, is a kind of hybrid model where the coach maybe has more control over what the play and train aspects may look like, but we can keep this kind of points-based 4-pillar approach to player development when our players have a more autonomy and more awareness of what it might look like within the recover and prepare pillar, as an example. So third resource, actually 3 resources in here, is how we might, back on the ground, how we might shape coaching practice. And the first one to share is the junior high. Well, we were originally intended for the junior high performance environment, but we've now started to filter out it through some of our coach education work to work with coaches at all levels as well. As this idea of the fingerprints. So practice design fingerprints were, again, building on work of others, whether you're talking about England hockey's golden thread as an example, or many other kind of practice design resources. The intent was that when someone who doesn't know anything about the sport walks past your practice field from a distance, just watches for 5 minutes, they would just say, that session has USA Field Hockey's fingerprints all over it. And we have these 5 fingerprints that we would look to try and get coaches to think about. One is the game. Doesn't mean we just play the game, but we would very much be advocating for a games-based approach to player development. But that means that we do play a lot of games, but also when we're not playing games, we're doing drills or technical work, whatever it may be. The players understand how and why that task fits into the bigger game. It's a really important thing for us. The second one was about decisions. So thinking in decisions per minute as well as touches per minute as a measure of practice quality. We want to be really deliberate about our language, and this is a big one for us. We have a lot of resources around the USA way, our principles of play and so on, as again many NGBs will do. But using that language consistently across the country can help us accelerate player development, especially in transition moments between, say, a regional environment into a national level environment. The fourth one is density. So here this is international age grade specific, but just deliberate manipulation of the density of practice. And that was really a response to this idea that we often, especially when coaches maybe start to adopt a games-based and questioning type style, there may then be periods of time where we spend a lot of time asking questions and activity isn't happening. So getting coaches to think deliberately about what are the outcomes of today's session, how can we manipulate that density? And the final one was resources. Originally, this was intended to be a counterpoint to the old checklist approach to designing session plans. But actually, in reality, this became a checklist and coaches ticking, played games, made decisions, language, which became a kind of counterintuitive to what we were trying to do. So we reframe these as really dials. And by manipulating the dial deliberately on each of these 5 areas, we can start to think critically about how we design our practice experience for the athletes. And I've had the 2-minute warning, so I'm going to keep moving quickly through here. The second set of practice design would be the Power 5. So these are designed specifically for developing goalkeepers. So we have the gift and the curse of goalkeeper coaches. Goalkeeper coaching would be low number of athletes to coach, and therefore the coach gets involved, can tend to get involved a lot in everything all the time. So fundamentally, these four principles, or 5 principles, so would be the game, thinking deliberately about our feedback, managing challenge appropriately. So Stephen mentioned Goldilocks in his introduction, that would fit there. The use of questioning within goalkeeping, and perhaps a really critical one here is giving goalkeepers voice and choice in their ongoing development. And the final one for shaping coaching practice would be these international skill games. So we created a series of 6 games based on general trends in terms of how nations play the game at the international level. Each of these games has an associated resource card and video and so on. And by using these cards, we're able to expose players to a broader range of experiences in our junior high performance and beyond environment, and really try and create some more tactically literate and more tactically more diverse performers as they move through the development journey. And given the time, I'm going to skip over the video, but I will share that after the fact as well via social. But back to the hook, the #1 positive pedagogy aligned resource, in my opinion. A real simple one, a modified ball. Again, not original, been used elsewhere. England hockey had quick sticks balls 15 years ago, but this oversized, lightweight ball for me is the most impactful tool we have in our arsenal to exposing players at all levels to the game of field hockey right from the start, that we would generally describe as fun, fast, flowing, and all those kind of good stuff you would associate with the game at the highest level, we tend to struggle with the technical demands of the game, especially early on. When playing on grass fields, as an example, the ball gets stuck in the turf. The experience isn't really captured. That fun, fast flowing is missing. By using these bigger balls, we can get kids playing the game, and parents and teachers playing the game quicker, experiencing that game, and then once we get them in, then we can develop them and move them, transition them into the smaller ball. So as an example, if you look at that top left, that's a close-up of one of the girls in the previous picture. That really hits the nail on the head for me. Traditionally, small ball, grass field, we would see that ball near her feet, eyes down, she can't see the game. With the bigger ball out from her feet, sits on top of the grass, eyes up. Now we can see the game, and now we can start to really start to get her to explore how we play the game, as opposed to just, can I dig this ball out of my feet, and this isn't fun anymore. On an older level, we might use different constraints to try and facilitate some of the, or emphasize some of that vision awareness. So as an example here, similar ball carrying position, ball away from the feet, head up, but using visors or foam visors with our junior team players to promote some of those aspects. So I'm just going to wrap up, Steve, if we have a second. I'll just play this quick 1-minute video. These are just some go ball examples that appeared on social media over the last 6 months or so, that I thought I'd just kind of knit together and throw out there so we can see it a little bit in action. And again, I'll share these resources on social afterwards, but I think, Stephen, I'm sure you're sharing the slides after this and so on, but that stuff's all there. All the resources are publicly available, and please feel free to get in touch, either Twitter or email, if you want to have any further discussion about any of this, or just coaching in general.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Really good. I obviously have been involved a little bit in working with you guys over there, so it's good to see the progress you've made over the last couple of years, especially during COVID, so it's excellent. Did we have, I'm not sure we had any questions come in the chat, but I was going to say, one was, obviously I mentioned like 4 features of positive pedagogy, and have there been any, well, it comes through to me that there's been some maybe a little bit easier to get on board with than others as you've been going through this process. So and depending on the timing of the process, so are the ones that you felt that you've focused on a little bit more earlier on in the journey, and that you plan to focus on later on?
I think, yeah, I mean, the big bricks that through across everything we're doing that people were trying to put in place would be this games-based questioning approach that's athlete-centered. They'd be the big themes across everything. I think we're relatively consistent with our messaging. So if you're going to come to USA Field Hockey coach development events, you're going to be exposed to these ideas. What we try and do with that as well, though, is, and perhaps what we can be better on moving forward as well, in all honesty, is try and support coaches to be critical consumers of things as well. So they don't just do it because we say it's a good idea, but they really consider it and then start to understand why it might work in this moment. And you touched on the beginning about drills, games. We're not saying you never do drills, but we're saying that if we attack it from the game side first, we can position those drills at the appropriate moment, at the appropriate level, and players critically can see the connection across the two.
Well, and you can also, like we've done with some of the stuff you just showed there with the athlete development model, you can make the more the drilly type of things, more inquiry based as well, right? So, but I think you made a good one, a good point about coaches and supporting coaches. So as they get the resources and try and use them in the field, thinking about how they use them, and that's part of the positive pedagogy, right? You start somewhere and you're going to get better over time. So it's how we as organizations and coach developers and everything helps best support the coaches out there in the field in moving to this using this framework. We did have one other question. So how does a positive pedagogy approach impact on how you define talent and thus selection? If a young athlete is then invited to have access to a pathway to elite sport. I know you define different pathways as well, and there's some movement in and out on those, so maybe you want to talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think how we define talent is a great question. This kind of my doctorate is kind of getting into a little bit of that stuff, but I'm still early on in that journey. What we would try and do is, and there was another question I saw come through about language. A good example of language for me across all our pathway stuff is we changed it from pipeline to pathway. And we're really deliberate about that and articulating and sharing it. Everyone's going to walk a different path. It's our job to meet you at the moment that you're ready for this and support as you come in, support as you go out. So yeah, that's what we try and do. We've actually just developed a new talent assessment tool, which takes into account, we try and separate out performance and potential. We're trying to use an approach that we would describe as more coursework rather than final exams. We have a culture, as a lot of American sports, of getting selected for the next selection moment, to be selected for the next selection moment. And we're trying to move away from that to something where we have a body of, I guess we look at the athlete or the player's body of work over time, as opposed to these perpetual selection moments. We would also look to be very deliberate about developing some of these psych skills. I mentioned the PCDE stuff, being deliberate about that to try and support athletes to navigate their journey. They're not all going to go in at the bottom of the pathway and exit at the top as Olympians. So whatever challenge it is along the way, we're supporting them in that regard. And in the future, finally, we're looking at some things like a My Path type program, which is essentially, you could think of it like a buffer on the outside of the Olympic development pathway that captures players who maybe just deselected 1 year. They can go into a pathway that supports them. They can opt in to have a degree of support, which can help them then get back in again. But it also might capture some of those who aren't quite ready, so we can upskill them in certain aspects so they can make the transition.
Yeah, so like the developmental model of sport participation by Cote and colleagues, so that's good. So we're going to have to segue out, Phil. Awesome to have you. Appreciate your time on a Saturday afternoon, as I'm sure all the audience do as well. So thank you very much for everything that you produced. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll get the slides out to people through some of the communications that we've got on emails, right? We'll put them on our landing page where we had the event and things like that. So I'm going to move over to Laura, who's going to introduce Letitia. You've already seen Laura and Letitia, but they're going to flip flop and help each other out here. So off we go. Dream team.
The dynamic duo.